Hi, good afternoon to everybody in London, and good morning to those of us who are in the US. I wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me to give the keynote at the Trust Conference. I wanted to thank the Reuters Foundation and Reuters for the important journalism that they commit, support, and provide and enable around the world, and also to thank all of you for coming and being interested in this subject. The last few years have been a tough time for journalists. Around the world, the election of demagogues in many countries has put an enormous amount of pressure on the journalism profession. So has the terrible financial problems that it faces, the loss of advertising. And there have been, even this year, thousands of layoffs and many, many closures of media outlets around the world. Indeed, some are calling COVID-19 an extinction event for journalism in many countries. And we've seen media outlets closing in Latin America, in the United States, and in Africa, among other places. Not only are there financial threats to journalism, but there are also great physical threats, as we've seen in the United States, where President Trump has constantly gone after journalists, bullied them, referred to them as fake news. And this terrible treatment of the free press has extended to countries like India and Brazil, Philippines, Russia. Many countries now are looking at the US and learning that it's okay to attack journalists. At the same time, we see more insidious forms of censorship, including one of my areas that I research, which is media capture. We've seen in many places these same demagogues who profess to dislike and distrust the media get their cronies and business allies to buy up outlets and to start to control them. For example, a perfect example in the US and the UK would be Rupert Murdoch and his control of Fox News, New York Post, and other tabloids. So journalists have really been under siege in many parts of the world. And even worse has been the COVID pandemic. So the COVID pandemic has caused revenues to plummet. It's weakened outlets that were already vulnerable to things like frivolous lawsuits. For example, Peter Thiel, the tech billionaire who shut down the Gawker site. There's a slap suit going on right now in Central Europe that many in the free expression community have been worried about. And then COVID-19 caused massive financial dislocation for media outlets, but paradoxically reminded everybody how important quality information is to societies and is to democracy. So the demand for news since COVID, for quality news that we can trust, has risen dramatically. More and more people are seeking out reliable news, and they need to, because the amount of disinformation circulating on social media, in many cases, it originates with leaders such as Donald Trump and other leaders around the world. And so there's been this infodemic, which is what the WHO has called it, of false information about COVID-19. And yet audiences have sought out more and more quality information from reliable and trusted news sources. So we're in a very difficult place where we recognize more than ever the importance of quality journalism, and yet the financial position of the media outlets has been weakened dramatically. The Reuters Foundation and many other foundations have done a huge amount to support quality journalism. They've brought together in many places NGOs and advocates to work with journalists, and journalists have really held up the quality of their reporting over the last few years. So the amount of investigative journalism has been enormous. Journalists have exposed all kinds of things. They've stayed on the job. They've been real watchdogs. And we're seeing fantastic journalism all over the world. The question is, how do you pay for it and how do you enable it to survive? I have a report coming out in a couple of weeks, or maybe a couple of months, we'll see the timeline, that was commissioned by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. And what I've done is looked around the world to see what solutions are emerging in this terrible time for journalism. And what's so encouraging is that many governments and funders recognize the key roles that journalists play. The scarecrow role, where just by existing, journalists can stop wrongdoing from taking place. The watchdog role as well, where journalists call and pursue stories and stay on it. They can set the agenda for society by being the gatekeeper. And they play an important role by amplifying voices that otherwise would not be heard. I'm actually reading a book right now, which is by a journalist from Mississippi who has spent 20 years trying to bring killers to justice who committed many of the murders of the civil rights workers in the 1960s. These people were not put in jail, and this journalist has spent 20 years going back to them, finding them again, convincing prosecutors to prosecute them with some success. So this is yet another example of the sort of dogged persistence of investigative journalists, which is so essential to society. So the good news, I've told you a lot of bad news about the struggling business models and the attacks on the press and the decline, we all know, of local news and the effect that's having on democracy. The good news is that there are now an enormous number of initiatives underway to help shore up journalism and to save journalism. Many European governments have stepped up since COVID started to give out more funding to journalists and more support. As usual, it's the good suspects, the people we always know who support journalists. So Norway and Canada, but even Singapore has given out money for freelancers. So has the Google News Initiative, so have many foundations, so has the South African Journalists Union. So small amounts of money have been trickling in to just shore up some of what exists. At the same time, I've really come to the view that if we want to really help journalism, we're going to have to think big and radically reform the legal and economic grounding that we use to support journalism. So BBC Media Action, for example, received money from the Luminate Foundation to set up, it's got a long name, so I'm going to check, an international fund for public interest media. And they're trying to raise hundreds of millions of dollars to support media in the global south, and not just outlets, but also institutions. The Global Forum for Media Development, the Oxford Internet Center, they've also been trying to gather funders to do large-scale initiatives. And we've seen some African journalists like Tibinyane in Botswana put together a proposal to help with digital transition of news outlets. So and a similar proposal has been designed in Kenya. So there's a lot of energy going into how can we help journalism in a large way and really shore up the institutions that exist. And rather than just, there's been a lot of financial philanthropic effort in the last 2 decades of helping create a conducive climate for startups. But I think there's a realization that we need to think really, really big now and support the large outlets, the BBCs of this world, the Reuters of this world, the major outlets that people turn to. In the US now, we've seen a tremendous amount of energy. So Steve Waldman, who used to be at the Federal Communications Commission, now has a proposal to do what he's calling transplanting of this almost 7,000 American newspapers owned by hedge funds. The idea would be to raise money to buy them back from the hedge funds and then house them in local places so that they can be turned into nonprofits. Victor Pickard, Tim Carr, Robert McChesney at the Free Press have been working on similar proposals. They are pushing for a tax on micro-targeted advertising online and to use that money to create a fund for journalists. Victor Pickard, I believe, thinks that we need something like a $2 billion endowment. And there's a number of proposals to try to get the new stimulus packages that will be approved under President Biden to include funding to support media outlets and to not just support the ones that exist now, but to make sure that the new ones, as well as the old ones, are more inclusive, are spending more time in communities of color, working with Black and people of color and Indigenous communities to make sure that journalism and the media truly represents them. I think the subtext for a lot of this is the hope that really supporting legacy traditional media and journalism will help counter the infodemic and the terrible resurgence of mis and disinformation that we're seeing online. I think that the hope is that if communities feel represented and have reliable quality sources of information, people will be less susceptible to looking at all the garbage that's out there. Garbage which we know is threatening our democracy, is threatening people's lives, and is also threatening people's health. So that's one strand, is supporting quality journalism and helping build it up. A second strand inevitably will have to be some sort of regulation. The tech companies have had years now to get their house in order and to do more content moderation and to really take down or hide a lot of the mis and disinformation. And instead, what we've seen is that their algorithms do the opposite. They recommend it to people. So the QAnon conspiracy has been recommended to people, and belief in QAnon has soared over the last few months if people have been stuck at home and spending more time on the internet. So I'm keeping an eye on some of the new regulations. Canada's talking about updating their hate speech laws. Germany's talking about updating their NetzDG laws. We're all waiting to see if the EU will act. And I think the final initiative that I'll leave you with is the very important moves right now happening in Australia by the Competition Authority, which is trying to get Google and Facebook to pay for the news that they use. Efforts to invoke copyright have failed in several European countries over the last few years. I believe it's Spain, France, and possibly Germany. But what the Competition Authority is arguing in Australia, and Rod Sims is spearheading this, is that there's really an imbalance of power, an asymmetry of power between the tech companies and the little media outlets, or even the big ones. And so it's going to be very important to come up with a way to force the tech companies to actually pay for the news that they are using and disseminating. Many of us are very hopeful about this new law. It would be wonderful if Australia could succeed where other countries have failed. And we're also working with governments around the world to make sure that they're in touch with the Australian competition authorities and trying to see what they can adapt for their other countries. So it's a time in which journalism is having terrible financial problems and is under threat, censorship of all kinds. But it's also a time of tremendous energy. Journalists are still doing their jobs. They're still reporting the important information that communities, societies, and democracies need. And they're starting to think more seriously about systemic ways that we can shore up the important work that journalists do. I'm going to close it here, but thank you very much for your time and for the Reuters Foundation and Antonio Zappulo and all the people that helped organize this important event. And I'm really looking forward to the next panel. Many of the people on it are close friends. Karen Attia was a student of mine years ago, and I'll be interested to hear their latest findings on where journalism stands today and what we can all do to help. So thank you very much for your time.